Very much for the invitation. We're going to have some recreation now. I am trying to extract from our project things that might be of interest to this group. The project itself is about Sicily, and it's looking at the transition between the Byzantine, two lots of Arabs, Sunni and Shiite, into Norman, and then from Norman to Swabian, as they like to call it there. And I'm going to, because there's not that much time, I thought I would just, first of all, introduce you a little bit in case you don't know the Normans in Sicily as a subject area, and then examine the two transitions into Norman and out of Norman, which is what we are looking at. And our project is a joint project with Rome and Lecce, as well as York, the bioarc here. And so basically York's providing the scientific investigation which goes under the radar of the history books and tries to put together the lives of merchants, artisans, and farmers as their regime changes. That's what we're looking at. And so I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction on the stuff, and then show you what our project is trying to achieve, and perhaps bring out some of the questions that we've got and some of the worries we've got as well. And maybe that'll be helpful in a general discussion.
Level, can I ask you to stand in front of the webcam? So
oh, this?
Yeah.
Do you want to stand still?
Well,
what, for a whole 15 minutes? I've never managed that in my life.
Just vaguely in front of the webcam.
Okay.
Sorry to cramp you down.
That's all right. I can have. You're looking at Palermo, and you're looking at the big building at the back. Your pointer.
No, just a mouse. You can use the.
Oh, mouse on here. Yeah. Okay, that's a big building, which is the Palazzo Normale. It's the Norman Palace. I'll put it into context. There it is. A nice reconstruction. And here are our Normans on the left of the screen here. Really starts with Roger II, then William I, William the Good, and then William II, William the Bad. And after that, there is a takeover. So these are all Hautevilles, and then there's a takeover by the Hohenzollern family, and Frederick II is the person that they will acknowledge as being King of Sicily in the later period. So we are interested in the, this part of the project is interested in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries into the 13th. And I should say in parenthesis, this has become much more interesting recently in the Mediterranean in general. Now, our Normans are not really quite the same as the ones up here. They've been in Calabria for some time, they've been in South Italy for some time, and they've been expanding, they've been controlling vast amounts of territory, and the idea of conquering Sicily came, but it came without real malice against the Arabs, as you'll see. Now what Roger II did was to introduce into Sicily a new idea, which was really quite personal to him, if you believe Jeremy Johns, creating a monumental landscape or a townscape in Palermo, which brought together Byzantine and Arab and also Northern European ideas, and created, amongst other things, the Cappelle Palatine, which you see here, which has got every known style in it. Kate, I think you should definitely go and look at it for about 3 months. It's absolutely amazing. It is a sort of amalgamation. It has been held up as a token of multiculturalism. The Sicilians are very keen to be thought of as multiculturalism. The present mayor of Palermo, Orlando, has set his platform on "We are the multicultural people. We welcome people from all over the land, all over the European, all over the Mediterranean." And there's a certain amount of evidence that this was indeed so. Here's the famous tombstone, dated about 1148. It has Hebrew, Arabic, Greek and Latin inscriptions, all saying the same thing. So it's like a kind of Rosetta tomb. And it's really just an icon of the general idea. Now the question is, does this only relate to Roger II and Palermo? This is one of the things we've been trying to find out, as I shall show you. The capital is enlarged at this time from the original where it says Khazar there. That's the old Byzantine and before that Phoenician defended area. And here Akhlisa is where the Fatimids had their headquarters. And then what the Normans did was throw a big wall around the whole thing and have their own palace at the south end there. This palace behind it has the Concordoro, this wonderful piece of landscape full of orange trees and lemon trees, which is watered from the hills beyond. Now, during the Arab period, basically 10th, 11th century, during this time, the people, the Aghlamids to start with, and then the Khalmids, brought in a whole lot of new crops from the east. As you know, the Islamic expansion was east as well as west, and the people who were in charge of various regions as a result of this conquest, the caliphs, if you like, gave each other presents. And those presents, the preferred present was a plant. And so plants made their way from Burma, like the orange, all the way across the Maghreb into Spain, where it ended up in Seville and became orange juice for Europe. So these new crops, sugar, cotton, oranges, lemons, spinach, less certainly rice, these are new crops that were hypothesized by Andrew Watson some years ago as being introduced at this time. Of course, what it did was to create an enormous amount of prosperity, because suddenly you had new crops which could also be traded. These are documented routes of the 10th, 11th century according to the Janitza, which is a library in Cairo, and Sicily plays a tremendously important part in this. Now, this particular map seems to imply that they're mainly trading pottery, but of course they're not. They're trading a whole lot of different things, including slaves, and they get passed through the island that we're interested in. When the Normans families and the Norman Hauteville families arrived, they were carving up the countryside and building a lot of castles. So if you like castles, Sicily is quite a good place to go on holiday. From the Muslimelli Castle, which you see on the right here, looking out of across the wall, you can see the kind of countryside that was dominated. It is extraordinarily fertile. It was already fertile before the Arabs came. It had lots of wine, it had lots of wheat, it had lots of olives. But after the Arabs came, the number of cash crops was expanded. So we're dealing with something here which was prosperous. The way that the villages, the landscape has been examined has been, in some places, like Catalafimi, quite successful. This is the Entella survey you're looking at here. And I've just used it as a couple of examples. So intensive surface survey to plot all the centres of settlement show that the big impact was not when the Normans, the big negative impact was not when the Normans came, but when the Swabians came. So this is the Norman landscape, and this is the Swabian landscape. And this is actually given, this is like a harrowing, another sort of harrowing, and it's even been claimed as genocide actually by my co-director, Alessandro Molinari, that they systematically decided to eliminate all the Arab centres of power. And that's odd, in a way, because they'd been so integrated under Roger II and William I, but suddenly it was no longer valid. And the astute of you will have realised that this is almost contemporary with the beginning of the Crusades. So there's a very strong ideological driver here, which has affected the landscape. So we've got certain themes that could apply to this period, could apply to the 11th, 12th, 13th century. There is obviously some kind of violence involved. There is integration involved as well, multiculturalism, prosperity. There is the development of the eastern trade routes, because they are taking advantage, when they first take control of Sicily, they're taking advantage of those eastern trade routes to Cairo and Syria and so on. And then it moves into ideological pressure, building from the Christian West. This leads to intolerance, genocide, if you believe that, the Crusades, and the trade routes then collapse into the western part of the Mediterranean. Now, a lot of our inquiries here are going to be on the people who aren't in the history books, but whose products are in the archaeological record. So we obviously prefer things that are in the archaeological record if we're going to use an archaeological method of inquiry. And so we're looking at agriculture, and we're looking at manufacture, and we're looking at trade. We have quite a large group of sources, about 20 different sources. Most of these are excavations previously done under the aegis of the Sovrintendenza, and they have created assemblages which have not yet been analysed or written up because the money ran out. And so what we've done is get permission to access these, and there's quite a few, as you see, distributed here, west, centre, east. However, of course, typically they're not all evenly distributed, and most of the sites on the west side, including Palermo, are mostly 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. A lot of the ones on the east side are multi-period, but also 7th, 8th, 9th century. So although we're trying to compare things, it's never going to be completely simple. In the centre, we targeted an area which appeared to be very fruitful and have used it as our excavation site. So this excavation, it's 4 excavations, this excavation area is trying to create a framework, an axis from which we can date and accurately read the changes that we're observing from what you might call the previous assemblages. Does that make sense? So it's like a package put together in order to try and say something about the whole island by saying something about 20 sites on it. This is the kind of thing that the previous excavations have produced. So this is Segesta, where that magnificent Greek temple lives. There's its Roman theatre. And right at the top, overlooking the Greek temple, is a Monte Barbaro. It's a barbarian's mountain. And on top of there is an Islamic settlement followed by a Norman settlement. And they're very, very close in date. So the culturally Islamic settlement is actually 11th century, so sort of moving right to the end of the Islamic period. And the culturally Norman part is also 11th century. So they are very, very close together. And they're probably coeval. In other words, there was a moment when the Arab citadel and its mosque and the Norman castle and its church were both standing, were all standing. So on the left you see the area excavated. There's the mosque, first one to be found in Sicily of the early period. And then here's where the castle is, that bit there. So it's a site of enormous interest, and it's been published, 1997. It hasn't had its analysis done. So although we've got 2 cemeteries, one of which is certainly Christian and one of which is certainly Islamic, they haven't really been analysed in the way that we can do that now. So those bones are in our store over in BioArc, and they are starting to do the stabilised detection of the DNA on them. Well, at Castronovo di Sicilia, which is the site that we've got in the middle of of Sicily, if you want to orientate yourself, it's on the main road from Palermo to Agrigento. It's almost exactly halfway along in the middle of the island. It is the furthest point from any beach in Sicily. So it's not necessarily such a brilliant choice, and this was left completely out of the research design until it was too late, and we were being ushered into this site. I'm going to show you a little bit of this because it goes on for quite a few periods. This is the situation last October. We dated that series of walls by stratification. Yes, stratification, I had it. It had lots of pottery, so the pottery could be ordered. It had different walls for each period. It had late Roman type, Byzantine type, Arab type, and the Norman type at the end there. Basically, Romans used mortar, Byzantines used opus africanum, vertical and horizontal. The Arabs used clay bonded walls, and the Normans seemed to have sort of more or less done dry stone walling. Of these periods, the Arab is the richest and the Norman is the poorest. So there's the sequence that could be made from knowing those attributes. Here is Castronovo. This is where we live in the summer. It appears to be, it's people living in it now, but it appears to be an Islamic foundation or Arab foundation because of its hydraulics. Basically, it's canalizing water from up the hill, distributing them to fountains, sending the water over the terraces, and then driving the mills, and then the water goes into the river. So that's our team: York, Rome, and Lecce. The ones I want you, these are the ones. These ones here are the ones doing the bioarchaeology. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about your work before I finish. Okay, first thing to say is that the scene in the Mediterranean has changed a lot since people used to say there wasn't any between the 7th century and the 10th. There is plenty. It's not so easy to recognize. Reason one, people go and look for it in the wrong place. They decide that if there are Roman ports, then the Roman ports ought to go on. But of course they don't go on. That doesn't mean all ships sink at that point. There are plenty of places to land. If you look at a map of Bronze Age Mediterranean, there are innumerable beaches where people came in with ox-shaped ingots. So there are plenty of places to land. It's much harder to find it if it's not concentrated. One of the places that have been found but not yet completely published are the Yenikapi ships, which were excavated in advance of the bypass from the station into central Istanbul, as it is now. 37 ships, and they are stratified. Amazing. They're in a harbour, which starts with Theodosius Harbour, and they're stratified, one above the other, and they've got things in them. So far, we just have a coloured book. It's in the library here, which shows you some of the boats. So there's an awful lot more we would like what's in the amphora. So this is just a little diagram. Karagiorgiou's late Roman amphora is on the left, and the one that we're putting together gradually on the right. And we seem to have closed the gap between the 7th and 8th. And so basically amphora traffic goes on all the way through the Roman period, after the Roman period, and into the medieval period, and certainly through the Norman period, certainly into the Swabian period. And you'll immediately see that there's a huge difference in their form, and that's ought to be significant. We know what's in these. Mostly it's wine or olive oil. We don't know what's in these, although lots of people say, well, it's obviously wine. It's not that obvious, because remember, we've got all these other commodities coming in. Basically, there has to be a difference because there has to be a change in the economic system. The Roman Empire, command-driven, is changed to a demand-led, where there are lots and lots of clients all spread around the place, including in Cornwall. And so they are bringing stuff to where it's a good idea, either politically or economically. The corridors of supply that were well known in the imperial period now are not practiced anymore, they're not followed anymore. So there's going to be lots of different routes all over the place. There's going to be more commodities than just olive oil and wine. And instead of having just the ports, you've got numerous landfalls. So no one said it was easy, but the point is you can't just decide that everything stops, and that has been rather the theme up to now. Olives will go on growing, and people will want to eat them. So we're looking at both cooking pots and amphora and trying to find out what was in them. We've also got a program of dating the residues. radiocarbon dating the residues. So this is being done by Ol Craig and Leah Drew, who's just come to us from Nice. The cooking pot program is also trying to find what was in the cooking pots, which is more relevant to the immediate village as opposed to the transport pots, which are more relevant to trade. The big problem we've got, unquestionably, is what happens to all the fruit. They've definitely had the fruit, they're definitely growing it, and they're definitely growing it around Palermo in the Conquistador, because we found some of these pots, things like that, which are typical for making sugar. And chemically, it's incredibly hard. It's not as straightforward as has been said by some. It's very, very hard, for obvious reasons. Sugar dissolves in water. You know, it's not going to be there. And so the only way that you could capture a product would be if that product was burnt or that product was sufficiently solid not to disappear. And the only reason I've suggested marmalade is because it's oranges plus sugar, which is a good start. But also there are these little pots called the botte, which we published in the Medieval Europe book, which do seem to contain condiments of some kind or balm. And so maybe that's what we will find, and that will explain the prosperity. Veronica Anicetti at Sheffield is doing the animal bones, and she's noted three things of quite some interest, I think. First of all, there is a lot of pork being eaten in 10th, 11th century layers in Castronovo. It is culturally as Arabic as you like, including North African type stoves. However, the explanation can be all sorts of things which we don't know the answer to yet. It could be, oh yes, they knew they shouldn't, but they did anyway. Or it can be that these are local people who are now under the control of Arabs in the Arab period, but not necessarily Muslim. That's also perfectly possible. We have an increase in the number of pigs. We have in the 10th, 11th, we have increased the number of deer in the 12th. That's a sort of normal attribute. And then we have this increase of size, which is extremely interesting, which I was raising a few minutes ago. The size seems to have had 2 leaps forward. And so for me, one of the great things about this project, which I'll probably end up still saying is one of the great things about this project without having had an answer in about 5 years' time, is that we know that people were trafficked. We think that animals must have been trafficked too, particularly for purposes of breeding, both in the 10th, 11th and 12th and 13th century as well. So these are our specialists here, and this is the cat's cradle that they're making their way through, with these outputs hopefully leading to these 3 main target areas, which are our research groups. It's exciting but hard to confront a whole civilization of any sort. To consult a changing one is even harder. The choices have to be made, themes have to be selected, and so on. Also, we are in an area that hasn't been completely well explored, and so almost anything we do is valuable to the people of Sicily, but not necessarily valuable to the wider scholarly community, who are all looking for much bigger answers and want much bigger questions, because that's how you get given a grant. This, just to finish with, is our complete transition period from the 6th century through to the 13th. And if we're lucky, by the time we get to the end, we should be able to say something about how the different regimes changed the mood of Sicily and its neighbours. To put some flesh on that rather wild statement, here in red are periods that we know were periods of conflict, or probably more seriously periods of fear of conflict, the sort of thing that makes you go up and build a fort on top of a hill, as they did in Castronovo at 1,000 meters up. And here on the right-hand side are periods where there was there are signs of prosperity. Now these both refer to archaeological data, but of course these, what's written there, refers to the documentary data. So we want our documentary data and our archaeological data to sing sort of antiphonally to each other while we're doing the project. And eventually there may be harmonious notes from time to time, much as we were talking about chickens earlier, which says, oh, that's interesting, maybe those go together. But meanwhile, you're extremely welcome to visit us. If you happen to be in Sicily, do drop in. We're right in the middle. Love to see you. Love to hear your views. Thank you.